Hi, my name is Reagan Hughes, and this is my presentation about Richard Wright. Talking about some of his early life, he was born September 4th, 1908 in Roxy, Mississippi. I believe he was born on a plantation, it mentioned. Both of his grandparents were slaves. However, his parents were born after the they were born after the Civil War, so they were free, and they weren't slaves. He was mostly raised by his mother because when he was 5 years old, his father left. However, his mother did have she had some health problems, which didn't allow him to be raised by her once he was a little bit older. I believe he moved with his grandma later and was raised mostly by her too. But when he was 12, he had not even completed a year of school, but he was finally able to attend school when he moved home with his grandmother back to Mississippi, and he learned very quickly, and he actually became valedictorian at age 15. While he was in 8th grade, he published his first story, The Voodoo of Hell's Half Acre, in the local black newspaper. And then, as I mentioned, in 1923, that's when he became valedictorian of his high school, so he made a lot of progress in a really short amount of time. So you could tell he was naturally very smart and good with his words and everything. When he was 17, he moved to Tennessee, and he studied at the Howe Institution. In 1927, he moved to Chicago, where he worked as a postal clerk, and he spent some of his time reading acclaimed writers and studying their writing style, which probably inspired him to write his own things. During more of his midlife career, 1937, that's when he moved to New York, and he met some connections with the Communist Party, and he began working for their newspaper called the Daily Worker. After working for them, he's written over 200 articles for that paper, and one of them, his short story Fire and Cloud, he received a $500 award from it. In 1938, that's when he published Uncle Tom's Children, which was a collection of stories, and it was a big turning point in his career. He was finally financially stable. That's probably one of his most well-known works. And then he kind of began publishing more and more after that. In 1939, he married Valencia Barnes Medman, and they had 2 daughters. However, he got divorced, I think about within a year and a half, and then remarried a girl named Ellen in 1941. In 1940, he published Native Son, which was probably his most popular, top-selling book. It was about a 20-year-old African-American living in poverty, so he used a lot of his personal experience from his childhood and everything with racism to kind of bring that in. I think a lot of people liked it just because it was really real and different from what people had seen. Not a lot of Black authors spoke out, especially at this time. And his career of midlife continued. In 1940, he published Native Son, yeah, sorry, that I already wrote that. In 1944, he left the Communist Party because of political and personal differences. In 1945, he published Black Boy, which was an account of his childhood in the South and depicted extreme poverty along with his accounts of racial violence towards Black. In 1949, Wright's essay, The God That Failed, which contained a collection of writings from ex-communist writers and journalists, was published. In 1953, his novel, The Outsider, it was a complex story about racism in America, and that was published. And then he died of a heart attack when he was just 52 in Paris, France. So those are some of his really popular accomplishments and writings that he's most well known for. And now some of his accomplishments. His novel Native Son was included in Times Magazine's list of 100 best English language novels from 1923 to 2005. So that's a pretty big gap and a pretty cool accomplishment for him. Native Son was also placed at number 20 on the Modern Library's list of 100 best novels of the 20th century. So that's pretty good too. His book Black Boy, it was an immediate bestseller, and it has literary and historical significance. Like, it's still used in schools. People refer to it. It was other writers like James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison were influenced by it. In 1939, he was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship, where he was awarded a $500 prize, which back then $500 was worth a lot more than it is now. So that's a good amount of money. In 1949, he received the Spingarn Medal by National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and the annual award given for outstanding achievement by African Americans. So that's a little bit about him, his life, things he accomplished, stuff like that. He was actually a very influential African-American writer of that time. And yeah, those are just some of the things that he did. One of the stories that he wrote, Bright and Morning Star, I'm going to talk about that next. So here's a little summary of what happened. It's the fifth and last story in Wright's collection under Uncle Tom's Children. So those were his really popular stories that first got his career going. It begins by introducing Sue, an elderly yet dignified black woman who's doing chores around the house when it's introduced. She has two sons, she mentions, Sug and Johnny Boy. Sug, however, is in jail because he was involved with the Communist Party. However, Johnny Boy is involved as well, so that's something that Sue kind of gets nervous about, because we also mention in the story that Sue's husband died not too long ago, and it was a big struggle for her having to raise her two boys on her own. So after her husband dying and Sug going to jail, all she has left is Johnny Boy, and she's really worried that Johnny Boy is going to get himself in trouble and she won't even have him. Sue gets a visit from Reva, a white woman who's in love with Johnny Boy and who always is worrying about his safety as well. She warns Sue that the sheriff knows about the upcoming communist meeting with Johnny Boy, which they're obviously sure that Johnny Boy's involved with the communist meeting, but Reva has to tell Sue that she's really worried because the sheriff knows and they want to crash the meeting and everything, and it could get Johnny Boy arrested or killed. Johnny Boy, though, does say he's very passionate about the Communist Party. You can tell it's something that makes him happy in life. He's striving to end racism and the division between like the economic classes, and he believes this is a good way for him to get his voice out and to fight for equality and be heard. But the end of the story kind of cuts off briefly. It says that Johnny Boy's not found before it, and Sue and Reva are kind of just talking about finding Johnny Boy and hoping he's safe, and Sue's praying, hoping that he'll come home safe to her so she won't have to be alone. And so that story was definitely supposed to be talking just about like African American inequality and people fighting for it, and just different kind of aspects like that. And then I'm also going to mention the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. I'm gonna get this screen to cover it if I can. There we go. Some of Richard Wright's work in the Volume 2 of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature include The Blueprint for Negro, The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, and Black Boy. The Blueprint for Negro, I'm going to talk about that one a little bit more than the others. I'm just going to go into depth on that. It was the Declaration of Independence from the writers of the Harlem Renaissance, essentially. It was like Wright's Declaration of Independence. To switch it up, and so there were a few main parts of it. One was 2 definitions of the role of the Negro, the hallmark of achievement for the black community during the time, and the voice of the educated Negro pleading with white American for justice. The minority outlook, Wright kind of talked about how the Negro authors aren't really writing about what they want to speak up for themselves. He says that the voice of the Negro worker has made strong attempts to strengthen the social status, but the Negro writer has not reflected this in the writing, so he's kind of pushing for them to be a little bit more, talk about their opinions and be more straightforward about what they think they deserve and everything. A whole culture. Oh, the church and the folklore. So those are like the 2 main things that they were saying, was part of the African American culture. Church is a big part of it, and folklore as well. So like songs and stuff like that. And we saw that even in the previous Bright and Morning Star. The woman Sue was always singing and under the stars, trying to make it all okay and everything. Another aspect was the problem of nationalism, because there's one black world and one white world. They talk about the Jim Crow laws, which is segregating, making black and white different for everything. Black school, black fountain, white fountain. So that was obviously a big aspect. That's a big problem. And then social consciousness and responsibility. Black writers should be aware of black history and responsible for sticking up for like how they feel and everything and how they believe. And that is pretty much my presentation, talking about Richard Wright and all of his accomplishments and how his life has been and a couple of his novels. So yeah, he was definitely a very influential person during this time. He made a lot of moves forward for the Black community, especially authors. And yeah, that's it.